I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. It's nice to see everybody. Let's see, we're up to. Okay. Let's return to the text. And for those who are actually following in the text by Jetson Chogi Gelson, we're on page 5. Right? And so we're kind of in the latter part, nearing a little bit more to go with the Vaibhashika, the Great Exposition School. And kind of where we left off was just a little ways down on the page where it says, so we're talking about this is their way of asserting object possessors or consciousnesses or subject. Object possessor is like a subject, right? A mind, a consciousness. And so he had just said there are two types of yogic direct perceivers, right? So there's a particular exalted kind of consciousness that directly perceives, according to this tenet system, reality. And it said yogic direct perceivers that directly realize the selflessness of persons, and yogic direct perceivers that directly realize subtle impermanence, right? And we said this because they don't have a direct perceiver that realizes the selflessness of phenomena, right? They don't assert that. So it's just the selflessness of persons. And then here they're saying there are two types of yogic direct perceivers that directly realize the selflessness of persons. So he's subdividing that category now, right? And remember, this is maybe the most important category, right, of all consciousnesses, because it's this is from their perspective, right? The yogic direct perceiver that directly realizes selflessness of persons is what liberates you from samsara, right? That's their view of the that's the consciousness that when one achieves it, one becomes an Arya, right? A stream enter, eventually becomes an Arhat, and attains liberation from suffering and its causes. So this is a very important kind of consciousness. And so then it says the first of the two types is, and I mentioned this briefly last time, but said we would pick up here. So the first is yogic direct perceivers that realize the person to be empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. I'll finish this little, and then the second type is yogic direct perceivers that realize the person to be empty of being a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity, of being self-sufficient and substantially existent. So those, I want to say clearly here, so those are the two types of yogic direct perceivers, right? They're both perceiving a type of selflessness of person. Now, what's important to understand, I think, from this school's perspective, is that the first of those two is realizes the gross level of selflessness of persons. And the second of those two is going to realizes the subtle selflessness of persons. And one has to realize the subtle selflessness of persons to achieve liberation, according to this school. And eventually you have to realize that. But it can be preceded by realizing the gross selflessness of persons. So let's go over each of those two levels of selflessness, right? And again, it's, what they label the subtle selflessness of persons, Prasangika Majjhimaka would label gross. But both are going to help us understand selflessness. So the first, right, a yogic direct perceiver that realizes the person to be empty of being permanent, unitary, and independent. So according to this school, right, that view, the view of a person being permanent, unitary, and independent, we would say is an acquired view. So that means it's not innate. We often differentiate those. If you've studied Lamrim, Lama Tsongkhapa, and others, differentiate these as they're acquired or learned misapprehensions and there are innate misapprehensions. And I said this word like last time I ended with this, that the innate misapprehensions are, we could say, instinctual. They're with us since beginningless time. We share them with non-humans like animals and so on. Whereas the acquired ones are learned, right? They can be learned in this life, or we could have imprints and have learned them in a past life and believe in them. But so this first one is a kind of view of a self that was somehow learned, whether it was in this life or in a past life. And oftentimes it's learned in the context of like religion or philosophy, right? Or culture, you could say too. And so let's go through it. So what this view holds, that there's a self, right, or a person, self or a person. And so we'll go through each of these three characteristics. So permanent means it never changes, right? Permanent means unchanging. And actually, I was thinking about this, like, obviously, when this was first written, it was in India, right? So it was talking about certain Hindu schools. But actually, I was thinking about like, it's actually funny. I was like, where did this come? I didn't grow up religious, but I was like, oh well, like I guess just from watching movies and TV where they say, oh, your eternal soul. Right? Because nobody ever said that to me as a reading. So we're reading. I don't know if somebody asked the question where we're reading. So I don't know if everybody has a copy of the text. Presentation of Tenets by Jetson Togi Gelton. I can. So we're reading in that text. I don't know if I can share it here.
Thank you.
Do you have the text?
Could you type it, please? No, could you type it so I can look it up on the internet?
Well, let me see if I can. Maybe I can share it. Let me just look if I can. Let's see, file. Yeah, I should be able to share it actually if I can get to my. I'm not sure how to. I'm just looking. I can. I have it on my computer, but I'm not sure how to get it from the. When I click on file, it doesn't give me the option of going to my computer.
Lauren, this is John. I think I have it also. If you make me a co-host, I should be able to share it.
Oh, okay, if you can share it, that'd be great. Let me see how to make you a co-host.
You go into participants, click on my name, go to the right.
Ah, there it is. It's finding your name.
I'll be back in a minute. I'm going to go out and get the document now and then bring it up.
Make host. Oh, make co-host there. Okay, you're a co-host.
Don't make me host. Make me co-host.
You want to make John a co-host? Yep. Okay, you're a co-host now. So you can share it whenever you have it ready.
I'll be back in a minute.
Okay. That way, if anybody else needs it as well, it'll be there because others may need the copy. Yeah, FPMT wanted us to just share it with people who are actually participating. So I guess Dondrup emailed it to some people, but we can keep sharing it. As long as you're participating, it's fine. Okay, great. Okay, so the first of these three characteristics is permanent, right? And so, like I was saying, right, like, so that's this view that you have a soul that's eternal, right? That's unchanging, or a self that's, or usually it would be something like that, right? A soul or a essence that's eternal and unchanging. And particularly though, the definition there of permanent means never changing, right? Yeah, eternally, you could say. Then unitary means not existing in dependence upon parts, right? So unitary means singular, right? So it means it doesn't depend upon the parts of your body and mind. And then the third is independent, right? That's the third phrase here. And that one in this context means not existing in dependence upon causes and conditions. And I was just sort of pausing to think about this. Of course, like there are various, this is why I was saying, like ordinarily they say these are learned in the context of like a religious tradition or a philosophical tradition. But it is odd if you think, there are a lot of, I was sort of reflecting on this myself and realizing like just in our culture, in this culture, like there are a lot of, what's the word, like movies and books and stories where it suggests one has that kind of soul, right? Some kind of soul or some kind of essence that's like that. Right? So like they'll show like just depict scenes where somehow the person died and they're, they're somewhere, right? And even people say that, oh, you'll see them again, right? The person died and you say, you'll see them again, as if they're somehow static, right? That they're a static essence that's somewhere that you're going to see again, that's going to look like and be like the person, right? Which is implying this view, right? So I guess what I'm getting at is it could be like a formal philosophical teaching, but actually like culture also can, if this kind of view, the view of a permanent, unitary, independent self or soul or spirit or something permeates a culture, then you can learn it in that culture. You can learn it from your culture. And if you start to believe that, then you have that acquired view regarding others and then regarding yourself. And so in this school, you have to realize the emptiness of that doesn't exist. Oh, I see. Is there a way to also share it, John? Like, is there a way to share it so people can also download it for themselves?
Maybe if that's right. If you got her email address, we could just send her the PDF that the rest of us have, and maybe I don't know.
Yes. Anybody why don't we do that? Anybody who doesn't have it, if you can just share your email address, then it can be shared that way. Oh, great, there it is. And if anybody else doesn't have it, because that'd probably be easier, then everybody can download it, so we can, yeah.
I'll share it right.
Do you want me to send it to people, or does someone else want to send it?
Ryan, do you want to do it? Okay, Ryan's doing it right now.
Okay. Should I leave it up so people who don't have access to downloading it still see it or not?
No, does anybody else then need it now that Ryan's sending it? No, okay, good. So we can go back then to just the other views so we can see each other.
Okay, and I'll stop sharing then.
Okay. Okay, good. But okay, so going back. So okay, so does that make sense? So you get the idea here, right? So this one is an acquired view that you learned, that a person learned through their religion or their philosophical context. Oh, there's somebody else to send it to. So Ryan, if you can send him too. And the idea here is that one reflects, right? One meditates, and one eventually, first through logic and then eventually through experience, one realizes that there is no such self. Now, I just want to share a couple of reflections that I thought were interesting, that actually one of the Geshes who taught this topic shared. Is I want to suggest a few things. First of all, actually, he didn't suggest this one. The first one I want to suggest is to contemplate for yourself, to what extent do you have such acquired views? Does that make sense? To what extent did your own religious background or philosophical background or cultural background, right? Because again, like if you're a little kid and somebody says to you, oh, well, when somebody died, somebody said, oh, you'll see them again in heaven, right? Or something. Like, did you internalize on some, what's the word, felt level, right? That feeling of beings having a permanent, unitary, independent self. So I just want to suggest that first of all, so to contemplate that. To what extent do I have this kind of view, right? This is acquired, it's not innate, so because again, like insects have the innate one. Everybody has that one. All human beings and all non-humans have that. But this one, not everybody has. But I think many of us have it, at least to some extent. And part of that is, again, you can reflect on what religious tradition you were brought up in and what did it teach you, but also what did your culture teach you? What did your family teach you? What did people teach you? Another point I wanted to make, this is one that came from the Geshe that was interesting, is that I just thought, oh, that was an interesting point, is does it have to be all three? In other words, for this to have this kind of acquired self-grasping at a self, sometimes actually my own reflect, I think, he was making a point and I agree with him, that it doesn't have to have all three characteristics, right? Like, so you could have a view of a permanent self, but you could never have even thought about, is it unitary, right? Does that make sense? Like, you could just think, oh, I have this unchanging soul, but you never could, actually, if you think about it enough, it would imply a kind of unitariness, because it can't be unchanging and be made up of parts that are changing. So if you thought about it, you would realize that these three are interconnected, right? But many people haven't gotten that far, right? So they might just think, oh, I have an eternal, permanent essence. And again, if you think about it, that implies that it's unitary, that it's not dependent on parts, and that it didn't arise due to some temporary causes and conditions, because if it did, it wouldn't be permanent. But even, so I guess my point in a way is like, actually, it's kind of funny, isn't it? To come to a point where you actually are grasping at all three of these, you'd have to at least be, what's the word, philosophically minded enough to have thought about the implications of your beliefs, right? And to have come to, well, if it's permanent, then it must be not arisen due to causes and conditions. But actually, if you talk with a lot of people, right, even somebody who grew up in a religious tradition, they might say, oh, I have a, who believes they have a soul. A lot of people wouldn't have even gotten that far, would they have? Like if you were to say, well, did your soul arise due to causes and conditions or did it not? They might just say, well, they might say God made it or something of that sort. But what does that mean, right? Like it's to actually reflect on that. Is it one thing or is it many things? And is it singular or does it have parts? Or, many people would not have gotten that far in their reflections, but they would still have this kind of grasping. Does that make sense? And that's what that Geshe was getting at. That once you have one part of these, you're grasping at a kind of acquired self. There's an acquired self-grasping there. And the idea here is a few things. One is we have this and you have to overcome it. Another point is that, because it's a grasping at a self. Another is it's easier to get at this one. Does that make sense? So it's a good place to start. If you have this one, it's the right place to start to sort of reflect on it and start noticing. And again, just to read about it is not enough, right? Then you have to check, do I personally have that? Do I have some kind of grasping at a self? And, recently I've just finished reading a book by one of my first Buddhist teachers, Jan Willis, and she was saying, in it, she was talking about, she kind of often, and sometimes seriously and sometimes jokingly, calls herself a Baptist Buddhist. But she gives this story where she was on an airplane and it seemed the plane was going down. And she was like, first, she was like, was praying to Chenrezig, I think she was saying, "Oh, mani padme hungs," but Jesus, was there too in her prayers. And so she said, well, I guess I'm both on that level. And she was, because who do you pray to when the plane's going down was kind of her point. And that's one, she's a professor of religious studies, and she was sort of saying that's one way to assess what's my religious tradition, which is a beautiful way. Then she did another one where her car got out of control on the Massachusetts Turnpike in an ice storm. And I think there it was, Mani Padme Hung was the main refuge. But anyway, so the point is like, what she was getting at is what this is getting at. Does that make sense? This is not like, it's an intellect she acquired, right? Her view that she was Baptist or something wasn't innate, but it was like if your car gets out of control in an ice storm, what do you pray for? Does that make sense? And if you believe you have an eternal soul and you want it to go be someplace safe and unchanging because it's unchanging, that's what this is getting at. It's acquired, but again, acquired doesn't mean intellectualized. In a way, it's conceptual, right? It is conceptual, but do you get the point there? This isn't like something that you could like sort of think of somebody sitting there with a beer and kind of going, I think this like this, or that's not what this is getting at. This is getting at that, what she was getting at there, what Professor Willis was getting at, which is like, do you have some view that there's an essence like that, that's permanent and unchanging in your being that you want to somehow preserve? And so, okay, so that's that one. And, and you guys, I think, know actually this text doesn't go into it, but there are many ways to refute those. And so one contemplates that. So one contemplates, how could it be, for example, if it's unitary and independent, it can't be related, they often point this out, right? Then it can't be related to the aggregates, right? It's non-relational, right? And yet, so they make that point. Well, then, actually, so even if you think that, right? If you think, oh, I'll see so-and-so, I'll see my, whatever, my grandmother in heaven, and then you imagine that she'll look like she did, right? And be like she was, then it's not unrelated to the aggregates, right? And they have to imagine, well, what would be that being totally unrelated to their aggregates, right? Do you ever meet somebody in a way that's totally unrelated to their body or mind, their consciousness, their awareness, anything about their body? And of course, you start to say, well, then that never happens, does it? And so on, right? And then permanent. What is there about a being that's permanent, right? And can something permanent be relational, right? If it's unchanging, how does it relate to a changing being? And so on. So there are many ways to reflect on this. And you can eventually come to a point where you start to realize, well, it's, and one way I like, what's his name? One translator, I'm forgetting who it is now, but makes a point. He says, this is an impossible way of being. In other words, that if you actually contemplate it deeply enough, you start to realize that to have a permanent, unitary, independent self would be an impossible way of being. It's a way of being that can't exist, actually, if you reflect on it. And when you realize that directly in meditation, you have this yogic direct perceiver. Now that's different from, and that's easier to realize. That level of selflessness is not easy to realize, of course, because you have to realize it in meditation. And if you've realized it in meditation, part of the idea is that then you wouldn't grasp at that, right? Then even if you think the plane's going down, you're not going to grasp at that. But you'll still be grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. That's subtler. Does that make sense? And that's the self that, again, like if, get this way, think of it this way, like if, like if a squirrel is outside and you run towards it, it runs away very quickly and it makes that sound, like sound. It doesn't have some view of a permanent, unitary, independent self, but it has self-grasping and it doesn't want you to hurt it, right? And you have that too. That's more instinctual. The reason I'm bringing that up is a squirrel is an example, right? It's more instinctual. It's more fundamental. It's more basic. And so we all have this, and that's what they mean by innate. Innate means it's not acquired by culture. It's not acquired by learning. It's not acquired by a religious tradition. It's something that it's not innate in the sense that it's intrinsic to your being. That's not what innate means here. What innate means is it's something you've been familiarized with since beginningless time, that it came with you from past lives, that you've been habituated to it from life to life since beginningless time. But it's not endless, is good news, right? That's why you can realize in a yogic direct perception that it doesn't exist. And so the idea here is that, I'll just go through these two parts, right? So this says a yogic direct perceiver, that yogic direct perceivers that realize the person to be empty of being self-sufficient and substantially existent. And so I want to kind of share it. So self-sufficient here means a self that does not rely on the aggregates and that cannot stand on its own. It's not dependent upon the body and mind. And then substantially existent means that would be an ultimate truth and that it cannot be subdivided. Remember, in this school, right, substantial existence means ultimate truth, right? And we gave those examples, like temporarily undividable moments of consciousness, or spatially, physically undividable atoms, right? These sort of undividable units of atomic structure in a way, right? Those are ultimate truths in the school because they're substantially existent in the sense that they can't be further subdivided. And from this school's perspective, like that innate self would exist like that, right? So it would be something that's an ultimate truth that cannot be subdivided. And so part of what they're getting at here is it would also be an ultimate truth, actually, right? That it's a self, it would be a self that is ultimately existent, and that's not just a conventional, right? Because conventional things, according to school, can be subdivided. And so, okay, so their view is like that, right? Is that, and then that's, so that's the idea. So the self-sufficient, substantially existent self would be like that, right? It would be self-sufficient in the sense of not dependent upon anything, including the aggregates. Okay, and it would be substantially existent in the sense of being an ultimate truth that cannot be subdivided, or further divided. I'm trying to decide where to mention a few things. So maybe I'll mention them now. I want to bring up just in relation to all of this, I'm going to make, we could go quickly, but I think it's better to actually go into detail, so I will. trying to think which thing to say first. I want to bring up something to make things, just to make sure you guys understand all of this, because, you know, I mean, I think those concepts are fairly clear, but I want to bring up something that I think is, you know, that can be confusing if we're not careful, but I think it's worth exploring, which is, I want to bring up a term from this school's perspective, which is imputedly existent. Now, and the reason why we have to be careful with this phrase is that those of you who have already studied Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophy, right? There's a phrase, merely imputed. You know that phrase, right? Everybody, like lamas often use that, right? Merely labeled or merely imputed. And now, and the reason why I bring this up is partly to understand this school, but partly to understand Madhyamaka, is when you say merely imputed, like that word merely is very important. And now we're going to understand a little bit better why it's so important, right? From their perspective, right, merely imputed means it only exists in dependence upon imputation, right? With nothing, and Madhyamaka, Prasangika Madhyamakas would say it has no existence from its own side, right? We often say that. So what I want to focus on here is, from this school's perspective, things that are not ultimate truths, right, are imputedly existent, but they're not merely imputedly existent. And I'm going to give an example for a moment, the self, right? The self of person, yourself. So from this school's perspective, yourself is imputedly existent, which means it can be subdivided. It's a conventional truth, right? Whereas it's not an ultimate truth. It can be, so it's not, we said, right, it's not substantially existent in the sense that it can be further subdivided, right? It's made up. What's the illustration of a self? In most of this, sometimes it's different, but it would say the 5 aggregates, right? Now, here's the part that's important to sort of reflect on, is in this school's view, things that are imputedly existent are not ultimate truths, right? But they do exist from their own side. They have a substance, we could say. And so in that sense, and this is subtle, I'm going to make sure, if you're taking notes, this is worth writing down. I want to differentiate 2 different phrases for a second. Substantially existent, I just said, right? Substantially existent means something is an ultimate truth. It cannot be subdivided, right? And so it's an ultimate truth object. But that's different from substantially established in this school. And so things that exist imputedly and they're conventional truths are substantially established. And what they mean by that is they have a substance from their own side. They exist from their own side. And I want to give an example of what I mean by imputedly versus merely imputedly now, just to make it a little clearer, because I think this could be confusing. I started saying, I'm trying to get into something that is intentionally subtle, is from this school's perspective, if you were to say, like, from this school's perspective, something that's merely imputed would be, Buddhism has these many things like this, like many metaphors, but one would be a sky flower. So there's, if I said, oh, here's a sky flower, right? Here it is, can you see it? They would say, well, that's just non-existent, right? It doesn't have any substance from its own side. You're just making it up. That's a mere designation, but it doesn't exist at all, actually, right? You're just using language, but it doesn't exist at all. Whereas from their perspective, if I hold up an actual flower, right, like say I hold up a rose or something, right, they would say, well, that's a conventional truth object. It exists imputedly, you're calling it a rose, right, but it has its own substance. It's made up of atoms, and those atoms are ultimately findable. Those atoms are substantially existent, and therefore your imputedly existent rose is substantially established, which means it has atoms that make it up from its own side. Does that make sense? And so that's how they're differentiating between things that exist and things that don't exist. They would say, if you were to say that something is merely imputed, that's like a sky flower. It has no substance from its own side. It doesn't exist at all. Things have to have a substance from their own side. They have to be substantially established, in the sense of substantially meaning having their own substance. And so in a similar way, like if I say, if I say I have an imaginary friend, Joe, right here or something, right? They would say, well, it has no, that your imaginary friend has no substance. There's no consciousness there, and there's no body there. It's not existent, right? That's a psychotic, it's a non-existent thing. Right? Whereas, if I say, oh, I'm friends with Jeff Nye, right? And then they would say, well, Jeff Nye is, of course, I mean, it's obvious, right? Jeff Nye is imputedly existent,
Doesn't
but he
exist.
has, what's that?
Doesn't exist.
But we could say that he's an existent phenomena, right? A conventionally existent phenomena means he has to have substance existing from his own side. So he's got that beard, that exists because it has atoms, and so on, right? And he's got eyes and ears and so on, and he's got consciousness because he just spoke, so he thinks, and so on. Made a joke even and everything. So he must have a consciousness and then there are these individual moments of consciousness that are substantially existent. Does that make sense? So you can see how this school is sort of, you see the point I'm getting at here. So there are substantially existent things which are ultimate truths that are unsubdividable and ultimately existent. But from their perspective, conventionally existent things have to have their own substance. And they would say if they don't have their own substance, then, and you're just saying, then like, well, one is then it has no meaning. How can you say that exists? It's like the sky flower. It's like the imaginary friend or something like that. Things must have their own substance, existent from their own side to exist. It's not just that everything's only mind, right? It's not that you're somehow in some kind of solipsistic fantasy. There are atoms, there are moments of consciousness. And so things have a substance from their own side. And that's how we can say they exist. But do they exist permanently? No, right? And do persons exist? And now you can go back. Now we can understand better why I'm going back to this second type of subtle selflessness, right? Are persons self-sufficient and substantially existent? No, right? They're imputedly existent. They have their own substance, but they're not self-sufficient in the sense that they depend upon the five aggregates, right? And they're not substantially existent in the sense that they're subdividable. It's like when you look at a person, there's a person there, right? But you would say, well, they're made up of atoms. They're made up of moments of consciousness. There's nothing static there. There's nothing, the person themselves, you can't find a singular thing that is the person, right? There's a substance there that exists upon which we impute person, but the person themselves is not substantially existent, right? Because you can divide into parts, right? So the person exists conventionally as an imputed existent, but is not substantially existent, and is not self-sufficient. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because if they have five aggregates, they're not substantially existent. I'm sorry, they're not self-sufficient because they depend upon. And they're not substantially existent because it's subdividable. Right? And actually, so now you can see, just the last point I'll make about this yogic direct perceiver thing, is now you can imagine, because you can imagine, we could just imagine it, right? So what's the experience like of a yogi, right, or yogini, who is having a direct perception of the selflessness of persons, right? And in this school, it's not like it is in the Prasangika Madhyamaka, right? In the Prasangika Madhyamaka, they say it's like a space-like mere negation, right? You're merely negating intrinsic existence. In this school, actually, what the person would be perceiving is, they would actually be perceiving ultimate truth, right? So they would be able to, through their yogic perception, they would be seeing individual moments of their own consciousness, and even those unsubdividable atoms, right? And they would realize that they're impermanent, and at first, and then later they would realize there's no self there, right? So they would see, in yogic perception, they would see these, like, can you imagine that though? It's amazing, right? They would see moments of, they would see the flow of consciousness at the level of, whereas like there are however many, different schools assert different numbers, 60 something or 300 something within a finger snap, right? So they would be in their yogic meditation able to perceive their own flow of consciousness, right? The stream of consciousness, and how it sort of goes moment to moment. And then when they look at their body, they wouldn't see a solid body anymore. They would see how it's made up of particles, right? So many particles. And they would realize directly in their own perception that there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent self there, right? Which would be an amazing experience, wouldn't it? You know, be humongously transformative to have that experience. They would realize that, right? That there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent self here. And you could imagine then that their mental afflictions would be, you know, would be hard to give rise to in the face of that kind of realization, right? So it's a very profound experience that this is referring to us. That's why I went through all that. Now you can see this yogic direct perceiver that realizes the person to be empty of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self is an amazing achievement yogically, right? An amazing meditative experience that one can have, that people have had. And you can also understand how, remember, like, I don't know if those of you who watch His Holiness the Dalai Lama, sometimes he says, like, he quotes Chandrakirti, who says, you know, so often has been quoting this recently when he gives teachings, where he says, you know, even very learned ones, if they don't have the imprints from previous karma, don't realize emptiness, you know, according to the Prasangika perspective. And what he's getting at is, like, even people who realize this, who are amazing yogis, don't realize what Nagarjuna was pointing at, right? So it's subtle. You get what I'm getting at? This is the very subtle points. And it's an amazing achievement to realize that. You can see that, I think, if we think about it. So now the text, I'll just read a little more and then I'll pause for questions, because it goes on, it continues with this, where it says section 6 is ways of asserting selflessness. And so first it says, subtle selflessness and the subtle selflessness of persons are asserted to be equivalent. So what that means, I already mentioned this, but I'll just say it again here, is that the reason why subtle selflessness and subtle selflessness of persons are said to be equivalent is there is no selflessness of phenomena in this school. This school doesn't ask that question, actually. Do phenomena have, you know, well, actually, first of all, they don't ask the question, are phenomena selfless? And if they do, to the extent that they do, they would say, no, they're not selfless. They have, what's the word? You know, there are, that phenomena have their own, you know, I mean, have an ultimate truth. You know, in other words, those partless, directionally partless particles are not selfless. They have an ultimate status, you know, so that there's not ultimately there's not a selflessness of phenomena according to this school. Only the Mahayana philosophical schools assert a selflessness of phenomena. And then it says, a selflessness of phenomena is not accepted because it is accepted that if it's an established base, it is necessarily a self of phenomena. And that's what I was getting at earlier when I was saying, you know, the example of the sky flower, right? The established base means if something exists, it has to have its own substance. And it has to have, and its substance has to be something that's ultimately true. Does that make sense? Otherwise, it would not, otherwise, from this school would say, they could, I mean, you can imagine them debating, right? And saying, well, otherwise, you know, make up anything. I'll say, you know, if they would say, if things don't have their own substance, then sure, you know, here's, you know, here's my, you know, it would be like when little kids did, here's my $5,000, you know, whatever, that I owed you, you know, we're good now, you know, and I'm going to go to the restaurant and I'm just going to hand them imaginary money. Well, you know, it's fine. They should accept that, because things don't, you know, like things don't have their own substance. Doesn't matter. You can see how this school would assert that, right? And so, you know, and so they, what's the word to say this right? And so they would say things have to have their own substance to be conventionally existing, right? Even to exist conventionally, which is imputed, right? They have to have something that's actually substantially there. It's not just made up. You know, from this school's perspective, like the mind-only school, the Madhyamaka school would be nihilistic, actually. Both of those they would think are nihilists, because they would say it's a selflessness of they would say phenomena are selfless, then nothing exists. You know, then there's no basis for the self, right? They would say, you know, the self is not substantially existent and self-sufficient, but it does exist, right? People create karma. And so what's the basis for that? They would say it's the 5 aggregates, right? And the 5 aggregates have to have their own substance. Otherwise, you could have imaginary friends and they're just as real friends. That's not true. So you could see where this school is coming from. They say, so phenomena have to have their own substance. And as it says here, so phenomena, to be an established base, it has to have a self, right? And a self just means it has to have that there has to be a basis there that's ultimately true. I'm going to pause there because then it continues on with the way of asserting selflessness with a different point. But I want to pause at that point. Just see, does anybody have any comments or questions before I go on? Ryan? You?
Yeah, I find this fascinating because, you know, we now know that atoms are like 99.99% empty space, right? I mean, from a scientific perspective. So like the idea that we're talking about two different schools within the same tradition, and one would see atoms and one would see empty space, and scientifically speaking, that's pretty accurate.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? That's, I mean, and that, you know, that's why I think it's really, I mean, you know, so often the Dalai Lama has been saying in recent years, you know, that you know, the value of the, I guess I'll say a few reflections on that. One is, you know, His Holiness often is pointing out like the value of these traditions, and sort of, you know, he created this whole series, like this, I forget what they call it, science, Buddhism and Science series, where kind of talking, you know, presenting these ancient ideas as a basis for scientific dialogue. And I've been struck by how often the Dalai Lama has met with physicists and, you know, now neuroscientists also in recent decades. And makes this point that, you know, that one can have meaningful dialogue, that, you know, and can have some, I've seen that where the Dalai Lama has met with scientists and has been able to question their assumptions in a way that the scientists couldn't, you know, we're like, wow, that, you know, or it's like they hadn't thought about it in that way, but it was tenable, the points, you know, and so on. So that's one point. And I guess I actually just want to share another reflection. So I agree with what you're saying, but I want to share just another reflection. It was just, for me personally, it was really striking the other day. I was thinking about it. I was like, you know, also the Tibetans haven't been in direct contact with the Pali tradition for over 1,000 years, right? Like, in other words, the Pali traditions came from Nalanda to Tibet and stopped being imported there about 1,000 years ago. And it was weird because I'm studying this, or I'm reading these, you know, reviewing this material. And I was like going like, if you read the Pali Sutras, like this explains what's in them very clearly. You know, it's like they didn't lose track of, you know, it's like they don't have the Pali, you know, they don't, I mean, they have some Pali Sutras translated into Tibetan, but they haven't had an ongoing dialogue back and forth. But the level of sort of precision with which they've preserved even these teachings, which they study, but which are not their main subject, it's not even their own main philosophical view, is pretty remarkable, actually. They've really preserved these different philosophical positions and the differences between them in remarkably precise ways. And if you read the Pali Sutras, this is describing what they teach, you know. And I was saying that, I was telling you somebody, or I think I might have mentioned it here, that my friend Geshe Darge had the experience. He went to, which country? One of the countries where they practice the Pali tradition. And, you know, as a monk, he hung out with a bunch of monks, went to one of the monasteries, and they were talking, and he was like, and at a certain point, he, like, some of the monks in the Pali tradition were realizing he knew their tradition, he knew details of their tradition, some of them better than they did, because he had studied it so much, you know, and he was sort of able to kind of point out subtle points, you know, that they hadn't really thought about, because he had studied it in more detail in some ways than they had. It's interesting, you know. So I mean, these are remarkable ancient traditions of analysis that the Tibetans have done a very good job sort of preserving and teaching. But other comments or questions before I make the next go on? Oh, Cynthia, yeah.
I actually have questions. So I'm getting confused when you mention the word substance, because for me it means to me like more concrete. So I'm having a hard time applying that to the more subtle aspects and still say that there's substance. I just wanna, and maybe you could give kind of an example, because I could apply it to consciousnness, but as it becomes more subtle, then how do I even say that there's a substance, you know, there's substance to it? So I don't, how would that be applied? So the other thing is, when you mentioned the about the earlier concepts with other religions, and I was thinking about reincarnation, like how do you, can you explain it within the context of reincarnation, if that makes sense? You know, where someone, you know, there's the, you know, is there an, like, maybe it's just labeling, right? Because Buddhism does believe in reincarnation. So how is that different from other, you know, religions? Because again, you know, I can relate to when you said, you know, your Professor Jan calls herself Baptist Buddhist, because I still call myself Buddhist Catholic, because I can't remove that. Right, I've been born with it, so I can't. Right now, I still can't identify. So that concept from other religions, how would you explain it in terms of reincarnation? How is it different? Does that make sense?
I think so. I'll try answering both, but then if I don't totally get it, you know, but the first part of what you said, like about substance, I think from this school's perspective, I mean, for me, the most useful way to think about it is, you know, and it also helps to see how it's different than the Madhyamaka perspective, but is that one way to think about it is that there has to be, this school would say, in terms of, because I get it, substance can seem like you could touch it or something, which is, you know, a moment of consciousness can't be touched physically, of course, but what they're really getting at, I think one way of thinking about it is this, is that they're saying that there has to be something ultimately findable from its own side. You know, that if you can't find something that exists from its own side, then the thing doesn't exist. You know, so, and in the example of the sky flower, right? If I say, oh, there's a flower here in this space, that, you know, if you investigate there, you're going to find nothing, right? If you really go investigate, there's nothing there. You know, or if I say, or even like the example, let's say, of a mirage, right? So I think there's water. You know, and then you go there and you investigate, you don't find one single atom of water, so you say it doesn't exist at all. Does that make sense? There's no substance there. Whereas from this school's perspective, it's that if an established base is necessarily a self-phenomenon, what they're saying is that if something actually exists and then it has to have its own substance, and the definition of own substance here would be there's something ultimately findable from its own side. And so from their perspective, you know, that would be if you investigated, say, a tree or something. You know, I'm just picking that because I look out the window and saw a tree. But they would say it's an established base because there's something findable. You know, the tree itself is made up of atoms, right? They know that. They would say, yes, it's made up of atoms. But the atoms are ultimately findable from this school. They would say if you search, no matter how much, you know, if you search to the deepest possible level, there is something there from its own side. It's not just your mind making it up. There's something that exists there from its own side. In this case, they would say it's the atoms that make up the tree. And those exist. And so substantially means from their own side. That's the first part. So it really does mean that, I think. It means that it has some existence that's findable ultimately, and that exists from the side of the object. It's not just made up. It's not merely labeled. Because they would say merely labeled doesn't exist. It has to have some substance there that can then meet with that label, and then you can say it exists. So I think that's substance in that sense just means it has something that's, so I would say two definitions then. One is ultimately findable, or two parts. It has to be ultimately findable, and has to exist from its own side, that it's not just consciousness, for example, right? If it's a physical object. I mean, mind could just be consciousness. You could say mind exists, but then again, there has to be something ultimately findable there. You didn't just make it up. It has the, you know, so that's the way I would define that, if that makes sense. Is that first answer okay for the first part of your question?
So so would that mean then that is it synonymous to findable being provable, or not necessarily?
Yeah, you could say provable. That under ultimate analysis, it's provable that it's there. You could find it. You could show that it exists. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
And then the second part about reincarnation, of course, this school, I mean, yeah, these schools, I guess you could say the Vaibhashikas, the Great Exposition School, I mean, they also, of course, believe in reincarnation. I guess, and the difference between that, you know, it's interesting, like between them as Buddhists and non-Buddhist philosophical schools. And they would, it's interesting because, I mean, whether it would be ancient Indian, there are many ancient Indian schools that believe in reincarnation. And then, of course, like some Christian school traditions like Catholicism believe in, I guess they wouldn't say reincarnation, but kind of heaven and hell. So kind of something that goes beyond death. And the main difference, I think, the main assertion in this school, right, you could say, is, as we said a few minutes ago, there is not a permanent, unitary, independent essence that goes on after death, right? We said that in the very first, the gross selflessness, right? So there's not some kind of soul that's independent of the body and the mind and that exists in your body. And they would say, that's permanent. And there are many, in Buddhism, there are many proofs of that. They would say, well, so for example, like one is they would say, well, if somebody were in one lifetime an animal, and another lifetime a human, and another lifetime a god in a divine realm, is there some permanent essence that's at one point a frog, at another point a god, at another point a human? No, like that's not findable. That's not something that you could ever find. What they would say, it's interesting, is that and that's where I was getting at earlier, like some of them say consciousness, some say the five aggregates, but the idea here is that actually it's in a way they get at the sometimes they reflect, this is my own way of analyzing this, is that sometimes it's easier for me if I start this way. What's the connection between Cynthia now and Cynthia when she was 3 years old? And if you think very deeply about that, right? Like, so there was a Cynthia who was a 3-year-old child, right? And a Cynthia today. And if you start to reflect, you say, well, I mean, certain things you had in common, but actually if you analyze it, it's like scientists would say, like the, most of the, what's the word? Most of the matter in that 3-year-old's or whatever body and the matter in your body is not the same, right? There is like, cells were changed, cells were replenished, there are different, molecules that have come and gone and so on. And the consciousness, like, is what a 3-year-old was thinking about and what you're thinking about. The 3-year-old wouldn't have been thinking about these questions, actually, would she? Like, so, if you think of a 3-year-old you who is being fed, something by parents or something, and the you now, it's like, wow, like, so your consciousness is very different. Your body looks different, is different size, is made up of different molecules now, and so on, right? And so, this is, I think, the difference is that, some religious traditions, right, would assert that there's something unchanging there that's common between the 3-year-old you and the you now. Whereas this school, right, the Vaibhashikas would say, there is nothing permanent, right? All things are changed moment to moment. Cynthia's body changes moment to moment. Cynthia's mind changes moment to moment. But the 3-year-old you, Cynthia, and the Cynthia today are connected causally, right? In other words, like the Cynthia who was 3 years old is causally connected, and what do you say? They're dependent. The Cynthia now is dependent upon the Cynthia who is 3 years old. She can only be here now because there was a 3-year-old Cynthia. So there's a relationship of interdependence between them, but that Cynthia exists the Cynthia then, on the basis of the body and mind, existed in a way that was designated Cynthia, right? Labeled Cynthia. And the Cynthia now, it depends on the body and mind, is labeled Cynthia. And what we would say is that, like, what this school would say is, like, and based on the karmic actions you've done, right, after death, just like there was a 3-year-old you and a you now, that in your next life there will be a being, right, who's just like the 3-year-old now, the you now rather, is dependent upon the 3-year-old you. They would say the you of a future life exists in dependence upon the you of a previous life who created a karmic actions. and then like the consciousness of now was in a continuum. So we would say the you now is in a continuum from the consciousness of Cynthia today is a continuum of the consciousness of Cynthia at 3 years old. And we say the consciousness of you in a future life will exist as a continuum of the consciousness of you now. And there's a relationship of dependence, which is that person or that being arises in dependence upon the karma and the consciousness of you at this time. But there's not anything eternal. There's not anything permanent. There's not anything unchanging there. Just as there wasn't between the 3-year-old and the you now, but there is a relationship of interdependence and of a continuum, of a sort of a continuum of what's the word? A temporal continuum and a relationship that's dependent upon. So this, the you of the future time is dependent upon the you of the previous time. And so they would say that's how that's how rebirth happens without, and from a Buddhist perspective, they make this point sometimes. They say, if there were something eternal and unchanging, actually, Buddhists would assert, then there couldn't be rebirth, actually, because there is something that's unchanging can't be reborn. It's permanent, it's static. There is that rebirth can only happen because things are impermanent, and that because, and through interdependence, through a relationship of dependence, just like if there was something permanent, the 3-year-old couldn't grow up to be an adult Cynthia. She would be stuck forever as 3, if she were permanent. But because she was impermanent, she can change and develop over time through causes and conditions. So they would say that rebirth happens in a similar way as change within this life, which is, it's a continuum where each future time is dependent upon previous time.
But Cynthia can only reincarnate based on her continuum.
Yep.
So can I then also say that the substance that they're calling substance is changeable in that sense? Okay.
Yep, that's
Thank
right.
you
It
so
is
much.
changeable.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's changeable. That's exactly right.
I have two-part question. One is, when this tradition is looking at the mind and saying that it has substance, they're saying that there are actually discrete moments of mind.
Yep.
Because obviously it's not a physical substance.
No.
Then my second question is, how do they rationalize that the mental continuum ceases at Nirvana if it has substance? That I don't understand how they're thinking about that.
Interesting question. So first of all, from their perspective, right? Like if you look on page, the previous page, page 4, exactly what you said is true, right? So they say that one of the two illustrations of ultimate truths that they give is temporarily partless moments of consciousness, right? So they would say that's something that has its own substance, a temporally partless moment of consciousness. And I sort of had those where, different masters say different things, but one said it's a 1/120th of a finger snap is that temporally part. Others say different lengths. I guess it depends on their yogic experience, but yeah. So that would be their view of the substance, is these temporally partless moments of consciousness. And then your second question is interesting, right? Like, so how does that end at the enlightenment? At the time of death for an arhat, right? That's because their view, which we'll get into. Actually, we get into that in the next. In the next section, the section on grounds and paths. One of the things that this school asserts, which because you mentioned it, is that they say that when somebody achieves arhatship while still alive, they're still alive, so there are still moments of consciousness. But they say there's a metaphor. I was thinking about this the other day when I was just looking at that material, which is it doesn't mention it in this text, but in some of the sutras it mentions this metaphor, Pali sutras, where it says the arhat at the moment of death is like a candle that was blown out or burned out, right? Like that sort of the continuum ends. it's an interesting kind of point. You know, it's hard. It's actually funny, right? Nagarjuna, of course, actually Nagarjuna explicitly disagrees with them and explains why. He refutes their position. But their view, in a way, right, is that the body and mind. Their view, I guess, is that the body and mind of let's say, take the example of, say, Shariputra or something, right? Like that Shariputra was born, right, as and you know, born as Shariputra due to his previous karma and self-grasping, right? So that being had karma and had self-grasping and was born into a body that was named by his parents or whoever, Shariputra. I guess his parents, yeah, because it was a family name. From this school's perspective, right, when that person, Shariputra became an arhat in that life, right? So he overcame the subtle self-grasping by realizing subtle selflessness from this school's perspective. And so from this school's perspective, what they would say, their view would be, he no longer has the cause. One of the two necessary causes of rebirth is self-grasping, because you have to have karma and self-grasping to take rebirth. So from their perspective, they would say he no longer has the self-grasping, so there's not a cause for rebirth, so he won't take rebirth. So they would say at the end of his life, there's not a cause that would give rise to a future life. So he's like a candle that got blown out, you could say, in the sense that there may have even still been residual karma from previous times, but like if there's no continuation of the flame, then the flame gets blown out and there's nothing, so there's no body and no mind because the person doesn't take rebirth. It would be their position. And so in that sense, the continuum ends because there's no cause for grasping. And so when that life ends, I guess you could say, it doesn't connect up to a future life because the cause of that future life was, one of the two causes that's required for a future life was cut off by his wisdom. And so it won't connect to a future life, so his continuum ends. You know, and I'll just say Nagarjuna's position, which disagrees with that, is intriguing in a way, which is Nagarjuna says, you know, wisdom is an antidote to ignorance. And so when you have wisdom, it cuts off the continuum of ignorance. I think your question gets at is in a way coming from Nagarjuna's kind of view, which would be, so of course, because it's a direct wisdom, the mode of apprehension of wisdom directly contradicts the mode of apprehension of ignorance. So it cuts it off. It's a direct antidote. But he would say, that's not an antidote to consciousness. You know, he would say consciousness is its own continuum. And consciousness is not of the nature of self-grasping. So Nagarjuna's position would be that wisdom is not an antidote to the continuum of consciousness because consciousness has its own continuum and consciousness is not of the nature of self-grasping because Buddhas, for example, have consciousness and they don't have self-grasping. So he would say their position doesn't make sense, which I think is what you were implying. But their position is really focused on rebirth. In other words, that since the being doesn't take rebirth because it doesn't have the cause of rebirth, its continuum ends because it sort of doesn't have a future body and mind. So where would it go? It's over. So that's the difference in a way. The Madhyamikas would disagree, but their view is really focused on because the arhat doesn't have a cause of rebirth, it doesn't take a new body and mind. Therefore, that being is sort of like a candle burned out.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful to understand it from the rebirth position. I guess they don't address the issue either of you can't go from something to nothing. You know what I mean? Because isn't that part of what the Prasankhya tradition is saying, that you can't just become nothing from something?
Yeah, Prasangikas would say that, Madhyamikas would say that in general. Whereas this school, this school doesn't address that. It's true.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sujata.
This is where I get confused. Thank you. This has all been super helpful. this is where I get confused about this school being posited as an antidote to nihilism. There's something about the materialism of that that feels ultimately, maybe it's just about the notion of a self. It feels nihilistic that the candle gets blown out. Does that make sense? I mean, of all the things that I don't have this feeling of like, there's nothing matters, nothing exists, about like tables and chairs and other things that ultimately are particles, right? Like that doesn't feel that sense of, when I think about when I'm teetering on the edge of nihilism, that nothing matters, and it's more about the existence of beings than it is about the existence of objects. And so there's like a material, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but there's something almost materialistic about the notion of, like expending all of the energy of grasping that results in rebirth, that when that's expended, it's just lights out, feels really nihilistic to me. So this is what I think I can never really hold this idea that this school is one that helps us avoid nihilism, because the ultimate nihilism to me is about, that the mind stream is somehow extinguished at Nirvana.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of get what you're saying. It's interesting, isn't it? Like so sort of, again, if you think, I'll just share again my own reflection, I guess, but I'm relating, what's being presented in this text to some of the Pali Sutras and I guess one thing one has to kind of, to really relate to this school's perspective on these things, isn't it? One really has to kind of think about, wow, it's interesting, isn't it? It's like a kind of renunciation, really, that it's like we're, from this school's perspective, I think part of it is like, wow, I don't know, it's just weird. I'd never thought of it this way before, but like, it's hard. I was like, wow, how do we relate to this school in a postmodern world, after things like, existentialism and so on, Nietzsche and all these other philosophers, but, and do we hear it in a way that, like, I'm just thinking of like a culture where the question is God dead and so on, is there meaning? And whereas what I'm reflecting on is like, if you think of the Pali Sutras, it's interesting, isn't it? Because like if their view really of that is like, of this sort of extinguishment at the time of death for the Arhat, was something to celebrate, right? It was like this idea that samsara is this horrifyingly suffering thing, experience, continue, a cycle, I guess you'd say, wheel, cycle, right? And so from their perspective, which is, respective of renunciation, actually, which we all have to cultivate in Buddhism, or, if we want to, even bodhisattvas cultivate it. But the idea really is that, isn't it? It's this idea that, that the meaninglessness is continuing. Actually, that's their idea, isn't it? Is that samsara is this meaningless continuum of limitless suffering and horror, and that one either continues in eternal suffering, or one extinguishes that, and that those are the two like existential options, actually, isn't it? That's this school's sort of fundamental existential perspective, is that either, I think that is it. Either you continue in this sort of endless cycle of misery, or you extinguish it. And that a hero, actually, a heroine, is somebody who extinguishes that and who breaks free from that and achieves liberation. And that's sort of that is the ultimate goal of this school, in a way, is to achieve liberation from this sort of, this otherwise beginningless and endless cycle of suffering. And so from their perspective, that wouldn't be something, they wouldn't look at that as something nihilistic or something, what's the word? Disturbing or something troubling. Like they would think, wow, like the person extinguished a continuum of suffering. You know, and before they passed away, they helped others too. There's no better, like they would sort of think that, isn't it? Is that like a hearer, right? Means that the person sort of realized became an arhat, and then from that moment until their death, they helped others by explaining what the Buddha had taught, which is the most beautiful thing a being can do. And then they achieved like the final ultimate liberation, and that everybody else who didn't achieve that is continuing on to suffer, and only that being achieved, only those beings who achieve that are free. So that would be their perspective, wouldn't it? And that would be this kind of highest good, or this amazing sort of, yeah.
Isn't that dualistic though? Right? I mean, like you've liberated yourself, but they're all still here. I mean,
Yep. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And this school doesn't that like, and that's at one point is that this, from this school's perspective, that's okay. Like they don't, you know, that's a difference from the Mahayana perspective. Yeah, there's actually, that's funny. There's not really a teaching on non-dualistic in this school's perspective. Not like non-duality is not something this school would talk about, I don't think. Actually, I can't think of any instance that I've ever seen where the school talks about non-dual.
It felt like that with regard to Skyflower or Existent too. Like there's a lot of things that feel dualistic along the way in the thinking.
Yeah, and this school is a kind of dualistic school. You know, I was actually thinking about that. You know, there are these many funny, I mean, there are many like Mahayana sutras where they use Shariputra as an example sometimes, but there are other arhats sometimes. But Shariputra is the most common one, where they kind of, right, there's that famous one that I really love was this one where, the one in the Vilmakirti Sutra, where they're in the, I'm going off on a very small tangent, but it's worth it. It's a beautiful story where I think it's Manjushri's, I think it's actually, the Buddha says to a group of arhats and bodhisattvas, oh, go visit Vilmakirti. And I think they all, like, I think it might be even Manjushri, I can't remember who. Somebody says, do we have to? Because Vilmakirti is a very provocative figure. And the Buddha says, yes, you have to go. Anyway, there's one passage in that sutra where Vilmakirti is a layman who's a bodhisattva, you know, and he's living with a goddess. And Shariputra says something like to the goddess, well, you've accumulated all this. Oh, first the goddess produces flowers, and the flowers fall. And on the bodhisattvas, they kind of, you know, fall around the bodhisattva's feet, but to Shariputra, they stick to him. And then Shariputra is trying to get the flowers off of him, which is this dualistic. And then he says, you know, and she says, what are you doing, Shariputra? And he says, they're sticking to me. It's not very suitable for a, you know, a monastic to have flowers stuck to him. He's trying to get them off. And then, and she starts pointing out his dualistic thinking. And later he says to the goddess, he says, you've accumulated so much virtue. Why don't you become male? And then she says, you know, because it's a better state. And then she says, you know, for 12 years, I've been here in this home looking for femaleness, and I can't find it. Can you? And then he kind of looks at her, and then she snaps her fingers, and suddenly she's in the form of Shariputra and he's in a female form. And then she says to him, well, why don't you transform? You know, and then he says, I don't know how. And then, and she kind of keeps messing with Shariputra. But I think what that sutra is getting at, in a way, is this dual, I mean, it's a Mahayana sutra that's getting at the dualism of this school's, sort of, in a funny way, I think, in a, you know, interesting, provocative way, getting at the dualism that still exists in this school. You know, and the goddess is somebody who's achieved a kind of non-dual state of realizing emptiness, and so she's sort of pointing that out and pointing out the ways in which this school still grasps that maybe at a dualistic, various kinds of dualism. And or in that case, right, purity and impurity, or monastic and non-monastic, or male and female, are all dualisms. And so the goddess, and Vilmakirti does the same thing, but the goddess in that instance is sort of poking fun, or pointing out the dualism in a kind of way. So, and there are various other sutras that do that from a Mahayana perspective. But yeah, so anyway, but this school doesn't get it yet, doesn't try to undermine dualism, really. It tries to undermine self-grasping and mental afflictions, but not dualism. That's not, Yeah, that's not an interest even of this school. Actually, this school would actually reify it. They would actually say consciousness is ultimately, moments of consciousness are ultimately existent, and atoms are ultimately existent. So there is a kind of ultimate dualism even in this school's perspective. Yeah, there's still time. So then I'll kind of go into the next paragraph, which is kind of an intriguing one. So I'll kind of preface it by saying, so the next paragraph mentions the followers of Vatsiputra. And so I want to clarify what that is. So I mentioned early on, there are 18 sub-schools that make up the Vaibhashikas. And one of those sub-schools I mentioned is the Theravada. That's the main one that still exists and is practiced, right? When we say Pali traditions, the main ones that are still existent in South Asia are the Theravadins. But another of the 18 sub-schools were the followers of Vatsiputra. So that was one of the sub-schools. And what this is pointing out, this next paragraph is pointing out, is that of the 18 sub-schools of the Vaibhashikas, 17 of them agree that there is that the person is empty of being a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity. But the followers of Vatsiputra are an exception. And often this school, it's mentioned in this text, and often it's mentioned by lamas who teach, because the Vatsiputras are one example of a Buddhist school that have an unusual, well, I'll read it and you'll see, but they're among all the Buddhist schools. Like, so there are 18 sub-schools of the Vaibhashikas, and then there are the Svatantrikas, and the mind-only school, and the Prasangika, and the various Madhyamaka schools, rather. And the followers of Vatsiputra are unique among Buddhists. So I'll read the paragraph and you'll see how. So it says, among them, right, so among these Vaibhashikas, the followers of Vatsiputra, one of the 18 sub-schools, accept the selflessness of persons, that is, the person's emptiness of being a permanent, unitary, and independent, Right, so they accept, saying they accept the gross selflessness of persons we mentioned earlier. It says, however, they do not accept a selflessness of persons, that is, a person's emptiness of being a self-sufficient, substantially existent, because they accept a self-sufficient, substantially existent self that is inexpressible, even in terms of being one entity with or a different entity from the aggregates, and being permanent or impermanent. So among all Buddhists, actually, all Buddhist philosophical schools, there's one sub-school of the Vaibhashikas, so that's why it's mentioning here, because it's unique. And in the context of selflessness, all the other ways they're similar to other Buddhists, but in this way they're different in the sense that they accept the first of the two, the gross selflessness. They accept that, right? That there's no permanent, unitary, independent self. But they're interesting. They don't accept that there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And what they say is that they say such a self exists but is inexpressible. And I want to pause there and say, sometimes I think about this. One is like, nobody goes around saying they're a follower of Vatsiputra anymore, right? I've never met anybody, I don't think there is anybody who goes around saying that. But there are people actually, there are people who say it's like, what's the nature of the self? It's inexpressible. And it's interesting, you have to really be careful. I'll just point this out if you're interested in it, if you think about it, in other words, is, there's a sense in which, of course, you could say empty, even from a Madhyamaka perspective, you could say the ultimate truth is inexpressible, so that's not necessarily a follower of Vatsiputra if you say that. But sometimes I've noticed when I'm talking with people, when they say the nature of the self is inexpressible, like if you listen carefully to what people mean, I was like, oh, sometimes they're not meaning what Madhyamakas mean. They're meaning something like it exists from its own side and it's inexpressible. And I actually think sometimes even mystics from other traditions are actually saying something similar to what Vatsiputras are saying. There's a self that's inexpressible. And if you actually listen carefully to the positions of people who are practicing, sometimes Buddhist and sometimes non-Buddhist sort of mystical practitioners, they're saying something quite similar anyway to what Vatsiputras are saying, followers of Vatsiputras. So that's one point. Just it's interesting to reflect on. And the last, I don't want to dwell on them too long because they're unusual, but one other point that the Vatsiputras, I'll just share this too, is part of why they say it's inexpressible is they say if you were to say that the self is one with the aggregates, because it says here, inexpressible even in terms of being one entity with or different entity from the aggregates, or being permanent or impermanent. And I'll just share like their philosophical position is they would say you can't say it's one with the aggregates because the aggregates stop at death, but it continues. It's kind of getting at Cynthia's question earlier. The Vatsiputras have their own sort of concerns about that. So they would say you can't say the self is one with the aggregates because the aggregates end at death, but the self continues. And they would say you can't say the self is a different entity from the aggregates because it depends upon them. You know, when you see somebody, you see the aggregates and you say there's so-and-so. So they would say you can't say it's totally different from them, but you can't say it's the same as them, so it exists in some inexpressible way. They kind of stop there and they just say that. And then the same thing with permanent and impermanent. They would say the self is not permanent because it changes moment to moment. But they say it's not impermanent because it's eternal. It continues on, you know, from life to life. No other Buddhist agrees with them. You know, no other Buddhist philosophical school agrees with them, but that's their position. And I think it's often worth noting, just because one is it's a unique position among Buddhists. Another is you could say then are all Buddhists, you know, we often say, sometimes lamas will point this out, the four seals, right? One of the four seals is the two of them are emptiness and self. Two of them are empty, you know, impermanent, suffering, empty, and selfless, right? So empty and selfless, you would say, well, do all Buddhists actually accept those four seals? Is one philosophical question. Because this is a Buddhist school that doesn't accept all four seals, but they're Buddhist in terms of refuge, you know, right? They take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So they're Buddhists. So you could ask the question, do all Buddhists accept the four seals, right? And this would be sometimes I think when the monks are debating, that would be something. But actually, you know, you could ask the same question. Actually, you could ask that and use followers like Vatsiputra, but you could say the same thing about, I don't know, say somebody who took refuge but doesn't really understand philosophy very well, right? Do they accept the four seals? Maybe not, but they're Buddhist in terms of refuge, right? So you could say, you know, which defines being Buddhist? Is it taking refuge in the three jewels, or is it accepting the four seals? Anyway, so that's another reason why sometimes the followers of Vatsiputra are mentioned. And then we come to the final of the 7 sections on the Vaibhashikas, which is their presentation of the grounds and paths. So the grounds and paths means like what's, you know, the path to enlightenment, right? How the stages and the stages of the path and what the nature of the path is. And so we'll at least start that section. Then I think we'll probably finish the Vaibhashikas next class, which is cool. Fine. So they say, in terms of this presentation of the grounds and paths, it is explained in 2 parts: the objects of abandonment and the actual presentation of the grounds and paths, right? So the objects of abandonment, what do you have to abandon or overcome in order to progress on the path? And then the actual presentation is, how does somebody progress, right? And so they say, what are first 7a, what are the objects of abandonment? So an object of abandonment means, right, what has to be overcome? What has to be overcome or abandoned or gotten rid of in order to achieve the goal? And it says there are 2 types of obscurations asserted: afflictive obscurations and non-afflictive obscurations. And decide where to start here. So I was going to say a few different points here. Like one point I wanted to make, just as a kind of beginning of this section on the presentation of the grounds and paths, I actually wanted to share something that comes from the Abhisamaya Alamkara, which is a Mahayana text, and it's a commentary to the Prajnaparamita Sutra, right, by Maitreya. But I just want to say this to encourage us, is the Abhisamaya Alamkara, which is one of the most important Mahayana texts, makes a point, which it says, bodhisattvas understand all the grounds and paths. It says, if you're going to be a bodhisattva, you have to study the grounds and paths of bodhisattvas, but also of listeners, also of Pratyeka Buddhas. Because if you're going to be a bodhisattva, you want to teach and benefit everybody, right? And so it makes this point. It says, so bodhisattvas study and meditate. They don't achieve the results of the listener path, but they actually meditate on it to understand it experientially, right? And understand it not just intellectually, but they actually study and meditate on that. And then they study and meditate on the Pratyeka Buddha paths. Why? Because they need to teach Pratyeka Buddha. You know, people who are of the lineage or the type who need the Pratyeka Buddha. People who are of the lineage or type who need the. So there's a beauty in a way. I just want to share that as a preface to this section. So I think it's very beautiful in a way. It's like the bodhisattvas study all the paths because they want to benefit all the different kinds of beings. And so part of why we would study this is if you are interested. One is if you want to achieve this result, you need to know it. But the other is if you want to be a bodhisattva, an aspiring bodhisattva, then you study all the paths because your vow is to benefit all beings. Does that make sense? So it's something very beautiful that I want to just share as a kind of preface. It doesn't mention that in this text, but it says it in the Abhisamaya Ankara by Maitreya. So I just find that very beautiful personally too. But okay, so next point. So it says there are two types, right? It said there are two types of obscurations. So the first is afflictive obscurations. And so afflictive obscurations are obscurations that obstruct. Obscuration means it obstructs something. So what does it obstruct? It obstructs liberation, right? Or you could say, in sometimes in Sanskrit, they say moksha, right? So you can't achieve liberation if you have these afflictive obscurations. And then, and I'm just trying to pause there. So yeah, so I'll explain more in a minute. Which order? Oops. I think which order to explain this part. Okay, yeah, I'll just keep going in the order the text presents it. And then the next type of obscuration are non-afflictive obscurations, and those are you could say what's the word they use? Stains or imprints. You could say latencies. I'll call them latencies. Those are latencies left over by the afflictive obscurations, but that are non-afflictive. So that, in other words, they don't cause suffering, and they don't serve as the cause of suffering, but they're kind of a remainder, you could say, or a latency left over by the afflictions. And the reason why they mention these two is that if your goal is just liberation, your own liberation, right? So if you're somebody who's following the vehicle, following the path of a listener to become an individual arhat, right? An arhat who's achieved your own liberation, or if you're somebody who's following the Pratyeka Buddha path, then you only have to overcome the afflictive obscurations, and you'll achieve your own liberation. But a Buddha, if you want to become a Buddha, which this school asserts exists, right? The school accepts that there are Buddhas, then Buddhas also overcome the non-afflictive obscurations. And then this school says there is no such thing as an obscuration to knowledge, as the convention or phrase obscuration to knowledge. And this is a detail which is probably worth mentioning because it's going to come up in other contexts down the road. But this school is differentiating non-afflictive obscurations, which get in the way of knowing things, from obscurations to knowledge, which are something that asserted in the other philosophical tenet systems. And what they're really getting at here is that what this school is actually getting at, I want to share this because it was sort of something I was thinking about as I was reading up and hearing talk about this, is this school, the text will point this out, but this school doesn't assert that a Buddha is omniscient in the way that other schools do. Like Mahayana asserts that a Buddha is omniscient in the sense that a Buddha knows ultimate truth and all conventional truths simultaneously with each moment of consciousness, right? Which is a remarkable sort of almost unimaginable thing, right? Can you imagine? I don't know. It actually is unimaginable, isn't it? To simultaneously know the ultimate truth and to know every conventional truth object that exists in each moment of consciousness is almost unimaginable, I think. And Mahayana Buddhists assert that's the Buddha's Dharmakaya. That's the nature of a Buddha's mind. It's a quality of a Buddha's mind, is it knows all that. And it's interesting, this school, actually, if you as we go forward, you'll see, this school asserts a view of the Buddha that's more in line with what you see in the Pali Sutras. Which is, so this school doesn't assert that a Buddha has that kind of mind. But this school does assert that the Buddha has, so this school asserts that the Buddha has amazing clairvoyance and amazing ability to see karmic past and karmic futures and so on. But they don't assert that the Buddha is omniscient. So it's a difference. And so they would say the Buddha has to get rid of non-afflictive obscurations so that they can see more about beings' karma in order to skillfully lead and benefit beings. That the Buddha gets rid of these non-afflictive obscurations so that they can, observe objects at a great distance and know what their students are doing, and that the Buddha can know the past karmas of beings and so on. So they have to get rid of those, but they don't assert that, the school wouldn't assert that the Buddha is omniscient in the sense of all-knowing, knowing all objects of knowledge possible in each instant. And so really this school follows more the stories. If you look in this Pali Sutras and you see stories of what the Buddha did, the Buddha's view, this school's view of the Buddha is kind of like, well, that's who the Buddha was, right? The Buddha was somebody who was born as Siddhartha, achieved enlightenment, right? Whereas if you're a Mahayanist, Mahayana schools say the Buddha achieved enlightenment prior to that, and that life was a display of the Buddha's enlightened activity, right? So it's two different views in a way. But it's interesting. In other words, I think actually it's not, that would sort of, in one way, I actually want to make a couple more quick points. Sometimes I think when you look at this school's perspective, one thing is like, you could say that the Buddha's display of enlightenment, as a Mahayanist, you could say that the Buddha's display of enlightened activities was for people like the followers of this school, right? In other words, that this school accepts that that was the reality of what who the Buddha was. So it's not a bad thing to accept that, right? The Buddha did that display to benefit beings, and part of that benefit was for the students of these students. That's one point. But another point I was thinking about is that sometimes people, particularly Europeans and some Americans or something, will sometimes take that part of this school and say, oh, you see, like the old, the sort of original Pali Sutras are more like us, like Western, skeptical, scientific-minded people, and we're like the original followers of the Buddha or something. That's not true, actually. Whereas this school is asserting, there is that somehow like this school still asserts reincarnation. This school asserts that the Buddha was clairvoyant. This school asserts that the Buddha could see beings' past lives. This school asserts that the Buddha could see what karmas the people were creating would create what future lives. So just because this school has a view of the Buddha that's more in line with sort of the Buddha's enacted life story, doesn't mean that this school is asserting that the Buddha was same as like a I'm sort of silly here, but that the Buddha was like a modern white person. I'm sort of being silly here for a second, but I'm just saying, like, sometimes people take that to assert that, like, oh, the Buddha's like me or something. It's usually Europeans and Americans. Anyway, that's not what this school is saying. This school is saying what this school is saying, which is that Shariputra could see past and future lives, and the Buddha could see more of them, and that the Buddha had all kinds of magical powers and could float around in the sky and could emanate bodies, and so this school is not like it's different than the Mahayana in its presentation of what a Buddha is and what a Buddha's qualities are, but it's not, it has its own presentation, and it's not a modern presentation, if that makes sense. I just wanted to clarify that, because sometimes people misinterpret that, because they say the Buddha doesn't see all objects of knowledge in an instant. The Buddha, isn't eternal, what's the word? This still doesn't assert a Sambhogakaya that emanates bodies everywhere, something like that. They would say, oh, then it's more like, some people would say, oh, then it's as if it were like sort of a modern ethos, which is not. But okay, so now we'll continue on. So afflictive now it's returning to page 6. So it says, afflictive obscurations mainly prevent the attainment of liberation, and non-afflictive obscurations mainly prevent the attainment of all-knowingness. we'll get into what that means. Illustrations of the afflictive obscurations are, for example, the conception apprehending the person to be self-sufficient, substantially existent, and the three poisons that arise due to the force of that conception, together with their seeds. So, and then I'll finish. And then it says the illustrations of the non-afflictive obscurations are, for example, the latencies of the conception of the apprehending the person to be a self-sufficient, substantially existent, and the negative tendencies of the mind that arise due to the force of those latencies. So what this is getting at is that the afflictive obscurations are the mental afflictions, right? And the most fundamental of them, according to the school, is grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And so if you want to achieve liberation, you have to overcome that grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And like all Buddhist schools, this school is saying that kind of self-grasping gives rise to, first of all, the three poisons, right? So ignorance, attachment, and anger or hatred, whatever, translate to attachment or desire, you know, you can say translate different ways, right? And then anger or hatred. You know, so when it says the three poisons, right? It's mentioning that. And some that when that's elaborated more, then they include like the 6 root mental afflictions and the 20 secondary mental afflictions. Those are taught in the Abhidharma, which is part of this, which is, you know, is taught by this school. You know, so there are different levels of elaboration of what are the mental afflictions. And one point is, so you have to study those. We have to know what those are because they're our main thing we have to abandon, right? So we have to find those we have to know what those mental afflictions are in our own experience, which we all have them, right? And then we have to overcome them. And, you know, you can temporarily suppress them. You know, we know this, right? If you study Buddhism, there are ways to temporarily decrease your mental afflictions. Like, so with desire, right? You exaggerate the positives. And so if you think of the faults of an object, you're less attached to it. And that's a way of kind of decreasing your attachment. And if you're angry, you can meditate on love, right? And like in the, you know, the Buddha has that famous quote, right? You know, love is not, you know, anger is not overcome by anger. Anger is overcome by love, right? So on a temporary level, we can overcome our mental afflictions by specific antidotes. But ultimately, in order to actually achieve liberation, which is the goal that we're being discussed here, you have to realize selflessness, right? That there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self, and that undermines all of the other mental afflictions, according to all the Buddhist schools, including this one. And so the idea here is that, so the illustration of the most important of the afflictive obscurations is that kind of self-grasping. You overcome that, and then you overcome the 3 poisons, or you could say you overcome the 6 root and 20 secondary mental afflictions. And thereby you achieve moksha, or liberation. Does that make sense? That's the goal. And then here I want to point out another thing. It says seeds, right? So it's not enough to overcome the manifest mental afflictions, but you have to overcome their seeds. And I want to explain, there's time still, because the next paragraph talks about the non-afflictive obscurations in terms of latencies. And I want to describe the difference between a seed and a latency for a moment. Because a seed, according to this school and this presentation, a seed means it's that it will give rise to that mental affliction again. Does that make sense? So you can have an overt experience of anger, right? But we're not angry all the time, but we have latencies, right? We have tendencies. We have seeds. See, let me use a quick word. We have latencies and we have seeds, actually. So in our case, we have both. And the seed means, like right now, I'm not angry, but then if somebody comes and says something to me, bang, I'll get angry so quickly, right? So easy to get angry. You know, if sometimes we're not feeling desire because we're, you know, sometimes you may not be feeling desire because you're too angry to feel desire, for example. You know, you're so caught up in your anger that you don't want to eat, for example, right? But that doesn't mean your seeds of desire have been eliminated. Once you calm down, you'll start desiring something again. So here the idea is that you have to overcome, in order to achieve liberation, you have to overcome the overt expression of the mental afflictions, or the afflictive obscurations, mental afflictions, and you have to overcome their seeds. And the seeds are what give rise to them again in the future. And it's meditation on selflessness, right? Realizing selflessness and directly realizing selflessness, that yogic direct perception of subtle selflessness, is what overcomes those seeds, and then you'll never give rise to them again. And that's the nature of how you achieve liberation. The difference between those and latencies, latencies are, they sometimes use this analogy where it will not give rise to the mental. Actually, I would say, first of all, a non-afflicted latency, we have latencies, but they're not non-afflicted, right? Our latencies are always mixed with seeds. You know, so we have latencies of anger, but they're mixed with the seed of anger. Does that make sense? Because we're going to rise to anger again. But what they're getting at here when they talk about non-afflictive latencies is arhats. That an arhat doesn't have mental afflictions anymore. An arhat is somebody who's overcome all their mental afflictions, but they still have latencies. And what that means is that it won't give rise to a mental affliction again, but it still causes them to, actually, and there are various points they make. One is, actually read the actual quote. One point is, it doesn't, in other words, so I'll read an actual definition. A latency does not produce the affliction again, but it does create an appearance to the mind. For example, as if there were, the appearance is as if there is a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So what that's getting at is like an arhat, right? An arhat doesn't grasp at a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, but they still have an appearance like that. Things still, as long as, according to this school, as long as they're still alive and have because their body, this school says, their body and mind of that life were created by past karma and mental afflictions. Now they've overcome the mental afflictions and their seeds, but they still have the residual body. Does that make sense? And the residual mind of this life, which give rise to certain appearances. And they say, because of those appearances, they still have experiences. And they actually they even give examples where they say, arhats, because of these latencies, they give examples, like they'll say, if there's a very loud noise, the arhat may still startle or something, whereas a Buddha won't, because they don't have even the latencies. And so, and there are other examples of it where, like in a moment, an arhat may still do some old habitual sort of action with their body, like, if they sort of gesticulated in some way or something or other, they may still act like that because it's still sort of part of their body and part of those latencies. Where they say a Buddha always has comportment, always, doesn't react in a kind of, they don't even have the latencies of such appearances, and so they're always subdued. Whereas arhats don't actually give rise to the mental afflictions, but their physicality is still conditioned in a way. That's this school's view, is that their physicality is still conditioned by previous karma. And so their kind of embodiment in a way, even though they don't give rise to actual experiences of mental afflictions, is still not perfect in a way, and still has these latent tendencies of past habits and so on. But also has the past habit of seeing themselves, for example, as if they have a self-subsistent self, but they don't believe that appearance. They know it's not true, but they still appear to themselves in that way until they die. And then, as Varahi's question pointed out, at that point, it's like a candle blown out, and they no longer have such appearances ever again, and they kind of go out of existence. But while they're still alive, they have this, these appearances and these tendencies, these latencies. So it makes sense. So a non-afflicted latency, you get the point now. So that kind of object of abandonment, the non-afflictive obscurations, are only abandoned by Buddhas. They're not abandoned by the arhats or the Pratyeka Buddhas completely. But the Buddhas abandon those, and therefore have these special, unique qualities that allow them to institute a tradition of Buddhism in the world, for example, because they have this greater wisdom. And there was one other point I wanted to, let's see. Yeah, maybe this time, maybe I'll just make this last point. It's a little confusing, this point about, like, I think it's a little confusing that they point out, like, that the Buddhas, right, overcome non-afflictive obstructions to achieve a kind of all-knowingness that's not omniscience, right? And so I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. What's their view? What's this school's view, right? Because, like, if we're Mahayanists, we say the Buddha, again, knows all, the Dharmakaya knows all objects of knowledge simultaneously in each instant, and so on. And these schools don't assert that. Again, as I said, they kind of follow more the stories of the Buddha. And so I'll just clarify that, and that'll be the last thing for today. They say that the arhats have overcome all their mental afflictions and are liberated. And they have clairvoyance, many of them, right? Like the examples, Shariputra and Madhyayana had clairvoyance, and Shariputra was the greatest in wisdom, and Madhyayana was the greatest in magical powers, and they had all these kinds of abilities. But actually, I'll share, I looked it up. There are 4 types of unique knowings or unknowings that are unique, that a Buddha has that an arhat doesn't. And this school asserts 4. So one is, compared to a Buddha, arhats are unknowing, aren't able to know the profound and subtle qualities of a Buddha. So there is that a Buddha's, because a Buddha's wisdom is greater and a Buddha's morality, and they give an example where they say, Shariputra couldn't even conceive of, like that the Buddha had practiced morality for 3 countless great eons, and it was so embedded, morality was so embedded in his being that Shariputra couldn't conceive of the depth of the morality of the Buddha. So that's an example of the first, the unknowing of the profound, subtle qualities of Buddha. Arhats can't know that, but Buddhas can. The second is unknowing due to remote, distant places. And they give the example there. They say Madhyayana was the greatest in magical powers and could see, like if something was happening in the next village, he would know what it was. And if there was somebody to be trained 3 villages over, he could see that they were ready to be trained, then he would walk there and teach them. But they give the example. They say when Madhyayana's mother died and she took rebirth, he couldn't see. He said, I can't see where she took rebirth. And then the Buddha said, it's on a planet so distant, in a realm, on a continent, or planet essentially, so distant, you don't have the ability to see that far, Madhyayana, but I can see. She's reborn on such and such world, in such and such place, as such and such kind of being. So there are limits on the distance that a arhat can sort of know what's happening, but a Buddha can see further and could see where Madhyayana's mother was reborn, for example. The third is unknowing due to the remoteness of time. And there, the example that's often given, and there are many examples like this, but is Shariputra could see beings' karma to a certain degree, right? So he could see, oh, this disciple has this karmic tendency, so if I teach them in this way, it will help them, and so on, which was wonderful. But there's a famous story, some of you have heard, right, that there was an old man who had worked his whole life and then he was kicked out of his workplace. So he showed up at the Buddha's community and said, I want to be a monk. And Shariputra looked at him and said, I don't see in you the karma to practice Dharma. I don't see that you have the roots of virtue, the merit. And the guy was kind of upset. And then the Buddha arrived. And the Buddha said, Shariputra, what are you doing? And he said, this guy wants to be a monk, but he doesn't have the karma. And then the Buddha said, it's the issue of the remoteness of time. Once, many eons ago, he was a fly. And I think he was like landed on a piece of poop that was floated in the rain current around a stupa. And so he has a little bit of merit. And you can't see it because it happened so many eons ago, but I can. And so I'll ordain him. And then he ordained that guy, and the guy became an arhat in that life, they say. And so they say the Buddha could see the tiniest bit of virtue that was so remote that Shariputra couldn't see. But there are other examples. But they say, so the example they give is the Buddha could see. There are stories in the sutras that give examples where arhats couldn't see due to the remoteness of time that a karma was created, but the Buddha could. And that's the often given kind of sweet example. And the last of the 4 is unknowing due to the infinite classification and variety of details of objects. And there, the example that's often given is all the colors of all the colors of the feathers of a peacock. And they say, like, when somebody would ask an arhat, what are the karmic causes of each of these beautiful colors, the vermilion and the aquamarine and the whatever, that the arhat couldn't know. But they say the Buddha could say, oh, well, in a past life, the beings offered this and that offering and therefore created causes for these different beautiful colors or something like that. Anyway, so the point I'm getting at, one is, so that these obscurations, unafflicted obscurations or obscurations to knowing, they don't assert that the Buddha is omniscient in the way the Mahayanas do, but they assert that the Buddha can see all these things. Does that make sense? And that the Buddha can see them more remotely and more detail than the arhats can. That's the essence of what's being gotten at here. And so what they say is that the opposite, so the first category to conclude, so in terms of we'll finish 7a, right? The objects of abandonment for arhats and Prajeka Buddhas are the afflictive obscurations, and they must completely eliminate the obscurations and their seeds. But if you want to become a Buddha, according to this school, then you also have to eliminate the non-afflictive obscurations, the latencies. And by eliminating those, you achieve this greater level of wisdom and therefore become a Buddha who can initiate a tradition on a planet, like the historical Buddha did, that's lasted up till now, and that's remarkable, and that gives rise then to the opportunity for beings to become arhats and so on. And so that's the difference between those two kinds of objects of abandonment. And so it's 12:30, so we'll conclude there. But I'll just say, so next class, what we'll do is we'll cover the actual presentation of the grounds and paths. I think we'll just complete that next class, and we'll finish the Vaibhashikas, then we'll move on to the Sautrantikas. And there are many points. I'll just say this too. There are many points in their actual presentation of the grounds and paths. I'll go into a little bit of detail because it'll help us understand all the different presentations. Because there's a lot of detail about what is the path, right? And so this is this school's view, but it gets at like the paths of different kinds of beings. And like I said earlier, also it's good, if you want to follow these paths, you have to know them, but also if you want to be a bodhisattva, you have to know all the paths, right? It's your job to know all the paths, because otherwise, how can you benefit all the different types of beings? So it's beautiful. But all right, so we should do the dedication. We just do those two verses. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And thanks, everybody. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank